Welcome to the Bean Pod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we always want to remind everyone that on this podcast, we are very optimistic about decentralized finance in general and Beanstalk in particular. With that being said, 3 things. First, always do your own research before you invest in anything, especially what we talk about here on the show. Second, while you're doing that research, try to find as many well-developed, opposing viewpoints as possible to get the best overall picture. And third, never ever invest money that you can't afford to lose or at least be without for a while. And with that, on with the show. On this episode of the pod, we're going to be talking about soil. On previous episodes, we've discussed beans, stalk and seeds, and pods, the last of which is the debt instrument that Beanstalk uses to make its credit-based system work. But some listeners out there may wonder how Beanstalk decides how many pods to offer to potential borrowers during a given season. The answer, my friends, is soil. So how soil works, its importance to the protocol's debt level and interest rate, and a number of other related topics are what I'll be talking about with Publius today. Publius, great to have you as always on the podcast. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us back, Rex.
Indeed. So today we want to talk a little bit about soil. Now, soil is kind of a fundamental component of Beanstalk, and really for the purpose of refresher, how about you just start by running us through what soil is and why it's important?
Absolutely. So soil is the willingness to borrow beans. And in particular, it's the willingness for Beanstalk to borrow beans. So if we think about what it means to be a credit-based stablecoin, beans are the assumption that a user is making of beans on their underlying stability is fundamentally one of the credit of Beanstalk as a protocol. And what that means is that Beanstalk, anytime the price of a bean is too low, meaning there's excess supply of beans in the market, Beanstalk tries to borrow beans from the market in order to remove enough beans from the market to return the price to $1. So soil is the willingness to borrow beans. And it is a very important part of Beanstalk because ultimately, when the price is below 1, it is soil issuance that serves a major role in helping Beanstalk return the price to the peg.
So right along with that, there have been some changes to how soil works within Beanstalk over its lifetime. Would you want to walk us through just some of those changes and how those improvements have affected how the protocol acts?
Sure. So soil is once again the willingness to borrow beans from the market. Now, the question is, at any given time, how many beans is Beanstalk willing to borrow from the market? How much soil is there? What is the soil supply? And so the amount of soil available is one of the things that has been improved over time. So originally, Beanstalk issued soil that was cumulative over time from season to season up to a maximum. And the concept was that if there was multiple consecutive seasons where there was an excess of beans in the pool, call it 10,000 beans over the previous 2 seasons on average, then Beanstalk would have outstanding 20,000 soil, or have issued 20,000 soil. Assuming no one had lent to it yet, there would be 20,000 soil. So the concept is soil would accumulate over time to reflect that the fact that the cumulative total excess of beans in the pool, that was what the soil was originally designed to reflect. And in particular, there were a couple problems with that model. The first problem was that the soil itself the amount of soil that was available would accumulate significantly, such that when Beanstalk would have an extended period of time where the price was below $1, the amount of soil would almost always accumulate to the maximum, which was defined as a percentage of the bean supply. And so the concept is that when the bean price was below $1 for an extended period of time, there would be a buildup of soil. And that had a couple of problems with it. The first problem was, if we go back to one of the core principles of Beanstalk, which is that it needs an efficient market for soil. It needs to incentivize lenders to lend to the protocol in an efficient fashion. The fact that soil would accumulate over seasons made it such that, let's say there's an excess of 10,000 beans this season, if I'm a lender that wants to lend to Beanstalk, but I want to lend 20 or 30 or 50,000 beans to Beanstalk, I would actually be inclined to wait to lend to Beanstalk once there's 10,000 soil, to wait for the soil to accumulate potentially. And while at the margin, the first in, first out harvest schedule would still have an effect on people's willingness to borrow, particularly when you had an extended period of time where no one was lending to the protocol, this buildup of soil was not helpful to the efficiency of the soil market in general. Now, the other problem, or problems, I should say, with the soil as it was originally defined was that the amount of soil would accumulate to a maximum as a percentage of the bean supply, and there was also a minimum soil available as a percentage of the bean supply. So, and I assume we'll talk about it in a second when it comes to measurement of demand for soil and why Beanstalk measures demand for soil. But the concept is Beanstalk requires the ability to measure demand for soil every season. And so it needs there to be some amount of soil outstanding every season. And originally, the minimum soil supply every season was a function of the total bean supply. I believe it was 0.1% of the total bean supply. And it didn't factor in the weather. And the problem with that was when you would be in a period of time where there was excess demand for soil, the protocol was actually issuing a ton of debt that it didn't need to be issuing. And so the original soil model had a couple of problems with it: the accumulation of soil over time, an arbitrary maximum soil that it would build up to, and then a minimum soil that prevented Beanstalk from deleveraging effectively whenever there was excess demand for soil. So those were the problems, if you will, that were quite evident in the original model. And since then, there has been a number of changes to the system. So let's talk about what's actually changed. The first is that the soil no longer builds up from season to season, such that if there's a 10,000 bean excess in the pool over the previous season and nothing changes over the next season, there will continue to be only 10,000 soil available. Beanstalk doesn't issue cumulative soil, and therefore there's no need for a maximum. Instead, Beanstalk only issues every season the time and liquidity weighted average excess of beans in the pool over the previous season. And it's designed to just on a single season trailing basis to try to remove all of the excess beans from the supply, from the market. The other change is with regards to the minimum. So there's no longer a minimum as a percentage of the bean supply, but instead, when the price is above 1, and again, there's no cumulative. So now you really only have two scenarios. You have the price below 1, and then the soil is a function of the excess, or you have the price above 1, in which case there's a shortage of beans, and therefore under, I believe it was BIP 9, that could be wrong, that introduced the improvements to the soil supply when there's excess demand for soil, such that the current amount for soil when the price is above 1 is equivalent to, basically answers the question of how many pods were paid back at the start of this season. The amount of soil available at the start of this season is based on the weather, the amount of soil such that the amount of pods issued during this season will be the same as the pods paid back at the start of the season, such that the pod line will stay a fixed rate, or a fixed length, assuming that the pod line will stay a fixed length, assuming that the there's excess demand for soil and the price is above 1. So that's a little history of how soil has evolved over time and what it currently looks like. There's probably some further improvements that can be made. For example, adding some sort of coefficient to the pods minted at the start of the season, such that the pod line length can actually decrease as opposed to staying fixed. That would be a marginal future improvement that could be made, and hopefully will be made prior to Beanstalk restarting or shortly thereafter. And otherwise, that's basically the current state of how soil is issued.
I appreciate that. And I feel like some of this also could go off into a separate discussion that maybe we should have another time about the length of pod line and some of the feedback that the protocol's gotten about the length of the pod line over time. But that's definitely a podcast for another day. So you did talk about demand for soil. And obviously, this is a really important component of how soil is issued. A lot of complexity in here. Would you want to talk us through that demand measurement process?
Sure. So the issuance of soil is distinct and independent from the demand for soil. But from a peg maintenance perspective, measuring demand for soil is very important. So at a high level, what Beanstalk tries to do is to gauge whether the soil that it has issued, the beans that it is willing to borrow, whether there's demand for that soil, whether people are willing to lend to Beanstalk. And people's willingness to lend to Beanstalk can be a function of an infinite number of things, but the only thing that Beanstalk really can change substantively to make it more attractive to lend to the protocol or less attractive to lend to the protocol is to change the interest rate, is to change the weather. And so fundamentally, what Beanstalk does is at the start of every season, Beanstalk increases or decreases the weather by up to 3% based on the price, the debt level, and the change in demand for soil over the previous 2 seasons. So the price and the debt level are a little bit simpler, where the price is either above and below $1. The debt level is either excessively low, reasonably low, reasonably high, or excessively high. Because again, the system, how it should react and how it should adjust the interest rate is different depending on how indebted the system is at the moment. How aggressive should it be? It's a function of how indebted it is at the moment. So the third factor that plays into the change in the weather every season is the change in demand for soil over the previous 2 seasons. So fundamentally, why is measuring demand for soil important? It's because Beanstalk needs to know whether it should increase or decrease the interest rate for lending to Beanstalk. And in practice, other than the price and the debt level, the other main factor that from a theoretical perspective it makes sense to consider when adjusting the interest rate is purely the market demand for the debt. And so what Beanstalk does, Beanstalk is designed to be as simple as humanly possible, or as simple as mechanically possible, we might say. So the goal is to classify demand for soil not in the most complex way possible, but simply to classify it either as increasing, steady, or decreasing. And I mean, there's probably an argument to be made for just having an increasing and decreasing demand for soil, but there is something nice about having a third class with which to choose from. And at the end of the day, as we'll get into how measurement of demand for soil is measured, it's pretty easy to see how you could do without the steady state if you don't want to. But generally, demand for soil is classified as either decreasing, steady, or increasing based on the change in demand over the previous 2 seasons. So we can get into how it actually works in practice, but what Beanstalk is doing is trying to figure out over last season and the season before it, how has the demand for soil changed? And if demand for soil is increasing, how should Beanstalk respond as compared to if demand for soil is decreasing.
So, how's the demand for soil measured?
Well, it's actually a non-trivial problem because at the end of the day, you want the protocol to be able to measure soil in a way that is not easily gameable. So what that means in practice is there's a couple of cases that stand out, right? One is all of the soil has been sown in a season. So Beanstalk issues soil, and all of that soil is sown. The concept is that should very clearly be a case, right? All of the soil is sown. But how do you define all the soil is sown? Is it if there's X soil, is it that you need X soil to be sown? Or what if there's 0.01 soil left? Is that all of the soil to be sown? So there's some complexity around what it means for there to be all of the soil to be sown. What Beanstalk does is it says if there's anything less than one soil left, that counts as all of it. So basically, the way Beanstalk measures demand for soil is either all of the soil has been sown, meaning there's at a most one soil left, or there was some amount of soil sown over the previous season, some unit of soil. And basically what Beanstalk does is first it compares the amount of soil that was actually sown. Now, there's a lot of cases that the demand for soil actually handles. So the first thing is just whether or not the amount of soil that was sown over the previous two seasons, what the ratio is between the soil sown last season divided by the soil sown 2 seasons ago. And based on the rate of the amount of soil sown over the previous 2 seasons, demand can be classified as increasing, steady, or decreasing. And I believe it's if it's greater than 105%, it's increasing demand, and if it's less than 95%, it's decreasing demand, and anything in the middle is steady. But as we were talking about earlier, if the beans are sown in all of the soil, or all but one of the soil in a season, that is sort of a special case. So if all of the soil was not sown last season, but all the soil was sown this season, that's clearly increasing demand. It used to be that it wasn't selling out. Now it's selling out. That's increasing demand. Now, if you have consecutive seasons where soil is selling out, then what Beanstalk does is it uses the time that it took for all of the soil to sell out to determine whether the demand for soil is increasing or decreasing. So it uses amount, it uses whether or not all of it was sown, and then assuming all of it was sown in consecutive seasons, it uses the time. And in doing so, Beanstalk is able to determine generally pretty well, although still not perfectly, whether demand for soil is increasing, steady, or decreasing. And if we go back to this rate, right, 105 and 95, it would be very trivial to make the rate 1 and say anything above 1 is increasing and anything below 1 is decreasing. But the current model does include a steady state, which remains to be seen whether in the grand scheme of things that will be helpful, but it was designed to allow for the model to have more flexibility than less.
So that kind of leads us into another good part of this discussion. Let's start with a scenario where demand is increasing. How does that play out in terms of how the soil supply itself reacts? Does that necessarily influence it? And really, B, how does that affect the weather and then subsequent potential actions by participants?
So the soil, the amount of soil that is issued is, I guess you can't say totally independent of the demand for soil, because in theory, if people demand soil, they may need to buy the beans from the market and thereby change the excess of beans in the pool. But in general, the soil supply issuance is an independent calculation from the measurement of demand for soil. Now, if there is an increase in demand for soil over the previous 2 seasons, that affects the protocol's response when it comes to changing the interest rate. So unfortunately, there isn't really a short answer in the sense that when the protocol, it basically analyzes 3 axes. So you have price, which has 2 cases, you have debt level, which has 4 cases, and you have demand for soil, which has 3 cases. So 2 times 4 times 3 is 24. So you have 24 cases based on the price, the debt level, and the change in demand for soil. And what Beanstalk does is it has effectively a table that it executes off of, whereby based on the price, the debt level, and the change in demand for soil, Beanstalk increases or decreases the interest rate, the weather, based on the table. So there's a couple nice things about this. One is that the actual contents of the table can be adjusted quite easily via a BIP. So the measurement of the state of the system is one thing, but then the response to the state of the system is sort of a separate thing. So the way that Beanstalk takes the measurements is very generalized, but the actual responses can be tuned or fine-tuned over time. So how Beanstalk responds when the demand for soil increases or decreases is largely a function of the other 2 factors, the price and the debt level as well. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing per se.
That's an important point. And I guess what I would say to listeners is there's a lot of detail on this in the white paper itself. And so Publius just talked through that kind of multitude of different cases. Those cases are spelled out with a lot of clarity in the white paper itself. So I'd direct anybody that wants to learn a little bit more and read those in detail rather than just having Publius, sit and read pages out of the white paper.
I think the only thing like at a high level that can be said though is when there is an increase in demand for soil, when people are more willing to lend to the protocol, Beanstalk tends to be, based on the figures in the table, Beanstalk tends to be more aggressive in its responses when it comes to the interest rate. Meaning Beanstalk is willing to lower the interest rate more if there's an increasing demand for soil when the price is too high, or it will raise the weather less if the price is too low and there's increasing demand for soil. So in both cases, the change in the interest rate is going to, if there is an increase in demand for soil, that's likely to make the weather net lower than it otherwise would be if there was a decrease in demand for soil. So that's the intuition.
Very fair point. So whenever we talk about soil, one of the other things that always comes up as a topic, especially immediately leading up to the exploit, was how do participants get a hold of soil? With soil supplies being relatively low at that point, there's a lot of discussion about things like soil sniping bots and what alternatives there might be that the protocol might offer. And do you want to talk through that process?
Sure. So the state Beanstalk wants to be in is where there's high demand for soil. If we go back to the stability assumption of bean users, the bean price will be stable at $1 if there is demand for soil. So Beanstalk, it doesn't really care what interest rate it pays as much as it cares that there is demand for soil. So, and it would rather overpay to clear all of the soil regularly. So for the month and a half maybe prior to the attack, maybe more than that actually, I think it was started in February. So February, March, April, 2.5 months prior to the attack, all of the soil that was available at the start of each season was being sown into. So people were lending the maximum, and it was highly competitive, and the only winners were bots that were all competing, and there were lots of failed sow transactions. And in fact, there was a BIP to change the way that the sow function works to minimize the amount of failed sow transactions because of how competitive it was. But the short answer is, if you can't access the soil because there's excess demand for soil, uh, Beanstalk, there's lots of other ways to participate in the system, including buying pods on the pod marketplace, which is the secondary market. So even if you can't lend to Beanstalk directly and get pods, you can buy pods on the secondary market, or you can participate in the silo. Going forward, you'd also, in theory, be able to buy fertilizer. So lots of different. One of the principles of Beanstalk is that you need a diverse set of competitive participants in the market that all have different risk and return profiles and strategies, and therefore that's where you get a competitive market from. So at the end of the day, lots of different ways to play this, and soil is designed to be the most attractive such that everyone would prefer soil, and Beanstalk, again, maximizes for demand for soil, or optimizes for it.
So Publius just mentioned the opportunity to buy fertilizer. For those of you out there listening, starting on Monday, June 6th, the barn raise is going to officially begin, which is our opportunity to recapitalize Beanstalk post-exploit. And one of the main functions of that barn raise will include the opportunity to purchase fertilizer. And we'll have other information about that on the podcast, and there's a ton of really good information that's been published by Beanstalk Farms. Encourage anybody to go to our Twitter feed or to the bean.money site, where there's information available about how to get involved in the barn raise. Publius, anything else you wanted to cover on the topic? Any other things that you think we should talk through?
Well, the long and the short of it is that soil is a useful tool to understand the state of the system. The willingness to borrow is a little bit hard to quantify, right? So soil is a nice abstraction of that, and then understanding demand for soil, demand for willingness to borrow beans. It's a little weird. So it's demand to lend to the protocol. I think soil has been a nice, within the context of the farming metaphors, the soil has been one of the best pieces of the metaphor to help explain things. But obviously, there's a lot of nooks and crannies. So it's very helpful here to walk through it all.
Absolutely, and I definitely appreciate it. Publius, as always, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, sir.